No, it doesn't want to come up. Sorry about that. Okay. Um, just having so many problems at this end this morning. What I'll do is I'll take you through the talk anyway, and then what I'll do is I'll arrange with Steve to have the PowerPoint slides circulated. Also, if there's time at the end of the meeting, I will take some questions from Q&A. So the purpose of the lecture today was to provide an introduction and overview of some key issues, and I was asked to think about bias and error. And what I want to do today is to just give you an overview of some personal beliefs, values that impinge on risk assessment, gain some best practice tips around faulty decision making, and just take you through some of the common errors that actually happen, and some tips to improve the quality of decision making. Now, I've deliberately included the term decision making because, sorry, I don't know why this other thing is happening. Let's just get them gone. Sorry. To take you through decision making, and I want to focus on decision making because practice and procedures are important and they assist us, but at the end of the day, it's all about making the right decision and accepting responsibility for our decision making. So what I want you to picture is a house. So foundations, sides and pillars holding it up, and a roof. This risk house is important because it's a strong visual metaphor to staff. They like it, and you can sort of think about your own practices against this house. So at the bottom, we have some key foundations. So there's a foundation of identification, which is about identifying the right offenders and the right risks. Also about analysis, so having the competency and the skills to carry out analysis of risk factors. The ability to evaluate our own practice and our risk methods and our risk assessment. And last but by no means least, good communication with others, but also with the offender, to particularly focus on what we don't know. Then on top of this foundation, we can put 4 pillars. These are the pillars of supervision, so appropriate oversight of the person, monitoring and control, effective measures of intervention and treatment, and then effective practice around victim safety. So those are kind of the pillars holding the house up. And then on top of that, because shit happens, we have a contingency plans of the roof, contingencies for future risk management failures, contingencies against the unexpected happening. And as I said, when you see the slides, staff really like that particular image. And it's all about thinking about your own practice and your organisation's practice against that risk house, because the house has to be adequate enough to provide public safety, and that's really the key step there. But this risk house can be undermined by faulty decision making, and so I wanted to focus on decision making today and literally think about why decisions go wrong. And decisions go wrong because they're very prone to going wrong. So I've been in the risk business for over 30 years, and I'm always more surprised that things go right than surprised that things go wrong. This is because risk is really the 100% predictability that you want from risk assessments can't possibly take place. This is because we're always making these decisions under conditions of uncertainty. So uncertainty about the knowledge we have in front of us, about the context and the situation, about a person's past, but also because there are quickly unfolding events that we find it very difficult to keep on top of, and also that things just basically get away with us. So risk is all about making decisions under conditions of uncertainty. If it was certain, we wouldn't even use the word risk. The word risk actually means that a number of possible outcomes of differing levels of acceptability and chance can actually take place. So all the time, we're working really hard to get that decision making under conditions of uncertainty more right than wrong. So we use things like defensible decision making to help us, and we put into place policies and procedures and systems again to help us. But defensible decisions notwithstanding, we have to accept and recognise that risk decisions are highly fallible and they're prone to error for a great many reasons. And understanding those reasons and those sources of fault can really help us and really help our staff. So I'm going to take us through 3 sources of that today. The first is personal bias. The second is about procedural issues that can result in faulty decisions. And the third is about organisational issues that can result in failure. So thinking about personal bias first, and I'm going to send you the information about this particular article and indeed some others to support it, but it was an important piece of work many years ago by a chap called Paul Slovic, and he looked at how we actually perceive risk and then respond to it, and he found some very interesting things. The first was that he found that we tend to over-respond to very vivid and catastrophic risks, sometimes out of all proportion to the likelihood of happening. And we respond to risks that are very, very personal to us. So COVID is a clear example of that. So people in high-risk age groups or who are working with that risk, or indeed know someone who's died from it, they tend to be more compliant with what the government is asking them to do. And if risks aren't personal to us, then they have to carry some meaning for us in order for us to become bothered. Now, this is why we see the active campaigning that we do, for example, through television media. So we probably have a remembrance of a couple of years ago, those NSPCC television adverts about abuse to children. And currently we're seeing government media campaigns about COVID risks, which are showing us real people suffering and real people working with it. So it's trying in a way to make it meaningful to us, so we pay it attention and we respond in the way that we are required. We also bring our personal values and beliefs to this risk perception and to this weighing up of risk. And COVID again is a key one about that. So, for example, some people are literally at the moment, they are weighing up their personal freedom to pursue particular leisure pursuits against their perceived low likelihood of catching it. Some people are weighing up the loss of income against appropriate risk management steps. So when we're weighing up risk, it's always about what do we value and what do we value more, and indeed also what we believe. So in this situation, if we value work and income and leisure more than we value the risk of COVID, and also if we've got a perception that we won't catch it, or I'm not risky, or it's something that only happens to older people, then we will weigh up that risk differently. And this is why we're seeing varied and differing responses to the COVID risk at the present time. And of course, those personal values, they come through not just in your private life and decisions about risk, but into your personal, into your professional life and the kinds of decisions you're making there. But of course, if we're affected by our beliefs and our values, then so are offenders. And they're also doing that weighing and those competing things about risk. And indeed, sometimes we use the word risk, but they would use the word reward. So we're not framing and seeing things in the same kind of way. And we need to understand that. Also, Slovic found that some risks are more acceptable than others, particularly at a societal level. And we can think about our criminal justice experiences of that, where we all see child sex offender risks as amongst the least acceptable. But where do we stand on drink driving or death from drink driving? And how do we make those comparisons, and should we? So sometimes the acceptability or otherwise of a risk is not necessarily related either to its level of harm or to its volume in society, but is sometimes related to its moral value and indeed to the repugnance that we hold for it. So if we think about some of those themes vis-a-vis our own working context, we are also bound up often with perceptions of genuineness, second chance, and unreal optimism, and those things can be very strong and they can contribute to faulty decision making. And indeed, if you think about it, we are partly paid to give second chances and gain rehabilitation and to be a bit optimistic. And so it's important that we can learn to recognise and mitigate those things where they are overly swaying our judgments. And learning from something like the Jasmine Beckford child death inquiry in the 1980s can be very, very salutary on this. So, for example, there's the power of unreal optimism. And it was very strong in that case because social workers at the time, their main aim was to promote and sustain family life, to improve parenting, and where possible to leave children with parents. So because of that, they invested small signs of improvement from the parents and small change with greater weight than they actually had. And they failed to look at the person at risk, Jasmine. Jasmine wasn't hardly seen. And they failed to test the supposed improvement of the parents, i.e. what the parents said they were doing, against a sustained observation of what the parents actually did do. They also interpreted those parental actions against the value frame of that unreal optimism and the desired compliance that they wanted to see from the parents. And that led to a major misinterpretation at the final case conference. So there was the last case conference before Jasmine died, the parents were in attendance and they acquitted themselves very well. And the case conference panel thought that they were reliable parents and they were doing very well. They made a decision not to continue strongly involved in the case and so on. And everything ended, as they thought, on a pretty positive note. And then there is a true story that at the end of the case conference, the senior social worker went into her office and she stood at the window and she saw the parents cross the road. And what she saw was them hold hands, turn and smile at each other. And she interpreted that as happy families. Now, a more realistic interpretation would have been, we got away with that one, didn't we? And I think within about 24, 48 hours, Jasmine was dead. So not looking, not understanding what we're looking at, and not asking are also other faults identified by many inquiries. So it's this reluctance to open the Pandora's box of risk. And if you ask, and then you know, you often have to act. But these actions can be challenging, distasteful, and time-consuming, so we tend to avoid them. And stereotypical thinking also plays a part. We all have stereotypes of monsters, but we also, importantly, have stereotypes of people who we think comply and are good bets. But we need to ask ourselves the extent to which we are blinkered by these stereotypes and the kind of influence that they're exerting over our decisions. We also misperceive causation. I'm going to try and explain this. It's a little bit difficult, but let's go through it. Because B follows A, we tend to think that A has caused B. So we then focus on A as the risk solution and as the way to prevent risk, but we often then end up doing the wrong thing. So, for example, Mr. X lost his job and then he did Y risky things. Therefore, we conclude that employment is the risk solution because unemployment caused the risk. Actually, it can be more complex than that because Mr. X does Y risks in situations of stress or challenge because it is comforting or re-establishes power, control and self-esteem. Therefore, any situation of stress and challenge needs avoiding, mitigating or managing. So missing cues because we don't know the case well enough is also shown in inquiries as being a risk fault. And again, when one investigates these failures or reads about them, it's actually quite difficult to believe that staff didn't see the red flags of risk. This is because some of those risks are highly individualised to the person and to the context, and they're deeply rooted in historical behaviours and responses, often that the caseworker doesn't know or doesn't really understand. And that can be exacerbated by a failure to analyse risk factors and ask, what does this mean? So often when you go and you investigate these cases, you see risks actually written down and listed, but it doesn't carry into any kind of analysis or action. People don't make a conclusion based upon what they have recorded. And that occurs much more often than you might think. Also bundled alongside this is often a failure in risk management plans to understand behaviours properly and what's risky about them, and a lack of monitoring and response to behaviours. And often in plans there's a lack of focus on changing those risky behaviours. So behaviours are often undersold within risk management plans. Then there are also policy and procedural issues that again mitigate against good risk management. Often these policies and procedures are there to assist you and to protect you and to protect the public, but there are some cautions that we need to think about. The first is that it is very difficult to proceduralise risk decisions because of those conditions of uncertainty I mentioned earlier. There are often just too many variables and options, so you just can't get them all down on paper. So the last 20 years has seen an increasing research focus on decision trees or decision flow charts. So for example, if A happens, you need to do B. If X happens, you need to do Y. But also a recognition that in some very complex situations, there's a bit of A and there's a bit of X. So these decision trees attempt to capture these future risk eventualities and the range of best responses to them. You can almost think of these decision trees as future risk scenario planning, and in very complex cases, this approach might have greater utility than mere proceduralisation. The second tension that comes up quite a lot is this tension between rules and practitioner judgment. And it's a perennial one, and it occurs not just in criminal justice, but in other walks of life. The key question is always, how much can risk decisions be controlled and enhanced by rules of what to do, and how much should remain the realm of practitioner judgment? And we tend not to resolve that one particularly well. Of course, that balance depends on the type and quality of the rules, but also the type and quality of the judgment. So the poorer the judgment skills and the poorer the competence of staff, the more we tend to rely on rules. But then the more prescriptive and constraining those rules become in real world situations that people actually work in, the more practitioners seek to override them or deviate from them. And where they are very constraining, practitioners perceive them as not helpful, and sometimes they will perceive them as a hindrance. Also, rules can conflict, so they have to be very carefully constructed. And I'm going to give you a simple but real-world example here. So in a local primary school, children aged 4 or 5 in reception class, they're taught by 2 teachers, one teacher at the front end of the week and one teacher at the second end of the week. Teacher at the front end of the week gives them this rule, which is you are not to leave the classroom and go into the playground unless you are accompanied by a teacher. The second half of the week, the second teacher says to them, if the fire alarm rings, you must go into the playground. Okay? Then shit happens because the fire alarm goes when they are on their own in the classroom. Some children obey the rule of the fire alarm and they go into the playground anyway, although they're not accompanied. Some children think, oh gosh, it's the fire alarm, but we're supposed to stay here unless a teacher takes us into the playground, so they stay behind. And then there are some other children who are just so paralysed and anxious about the conflict of these 2 rules that they sort of do a bit of a headless chicken act. Now, that sort of demonstrates the careful construction of rules that need to take place, but also that rules have to be underpinned by commonly accepted and understood aims and desirable outcomes. In their case, to be safe. In our case, public safety. So procedures or rules that tend to encourage desirable actions against commonly agreed outcomes like public safety tend to do better. And they also tend to encourage and enable better quality decision making. But we do see tensions. So for example, in the NHS, we will often see tensions between timeliness and thorough diagnosis. In our case, we often have tensions between timeliness to complete risk assessment tools against the need for full information gathering and analysis of risk. So a good question in this kind of context, when you're thinking about practice standards and rules and what to do, is, for example, to say what constitutes a quality risk assessment, what would be the core components and activities, and then design practice standards to encourage this. We also know that there are organisational issues which can produce risk. That sounds a bit odd, that the organisations designed to assess and manage risk can actually themselves produce dangerousness. But Duncan and Rader and Calder, amongst others, wrote very compellingly about this. And they had the notion of dangerous professionals, but also dangerous organisations. And that is organisations that not only fail to manage risk well, but also in a way produce it because of their lack of action or the actions that they take, or that they focus on the wrong things. So, for example, organisations with out-of-date policies and procedures, or organisations that produce professional and practice standards which are actually quite disabling and constraining and don't enable the best practice from staff. And then organisations that fail to keep pace with practice and fail to keep pace with the ever-moving research base. They are simply just out of date. Also, some organisations will favour and prioritise outputs over outcomes. So, for example, the number of cases promptly dealt with rather than the amount of safety actually produced. Lack of staff training, supervision, challenging constructive advice are also required, but some organisations almost actively stymie that and prevent it from happening. We know from many inquiries that the lone worker is a spectre, and the lone worker tends to be a dangerous worker. Also, problems about leadership, and particularly lack of leadership about core aims. So what is core business, and what are the priorities that we've set, and do we meet them? How many of us can genuinely say that public safety is our core aim and number one priority, and demonstrate that most of the work we and our agency do is actually about achieving that? Resource constraints are also very real, and they never go away. So openly and transparently decide on those risk priorities and then stick to them. And finally, continuously improve staff competence to do the job. Because if you don't, then the quality of your practice today is the quality and standard of the least well-performing person. Not the best performing person, but the least well-performing person, because it's that level of practice that's going to get you into trouble. So let's think about some solutions. So the first is this issue about personal bias, where I started. So what is it that we can reasonably do about that? Well, the first tip is to focus on the evidence. It sounds simple, but actually when you talk to people, you realise that a lot of things that they are calling evidence is actually assumption. So a good question is always to say to people, how do you know that? What is the evidence for the statement that you're making? What are you basing that judgment on? All of that makes people explicitly account for the source of knowledge, and it's a bit of a test. Also, we need to think about what we don't know and how that's impinging on any decision. So, for example, what is the difference if I appear with one previous sexual conviction and one charge, and then you suddenly knowing that there are 100 other offences taken into consideration? Also, we need to think about whether we need to change our minds. So Eileen Munro did an important investigations into child protection practice in the 2000s. And one of the things that she found was the power of first impression. So the first impression that social workers had of parents and of families really stuck with them, even in the face of mounting evidence to the contrary. She found that practitioners really didn't like to change their mind. And one of the problems we have with changing our mind is that sometimes we think it's going to make us look a wee bit foolish. I know, boss, I said to you in the beginning that this was low to medium risk, but now I need to tell you because of X, Y, and Z, it's actually high risk. Now, there are two ways to think about that. You can either be fearful of that and think that it shows you as not competent, or you can say that the refinement of judgment is really one of the core components of professionalism, and that's really what we expect from staff, the continuous refinement of judgment. Also think about what you are not asking about and why, and what you are avoiding. And team leaders and supervisors must ask that question of caseworkers. Also think about what you and others react to in the case and how that's impacting on assessment and decisions. What is there about this case that's up close and personal? And if so, are you being objective, or do you need help to ensure that objectivity? What is the weight of evidence in the case? And why is one factor more compelling for you than another? And believe me, that is often the case, that one or two things in an assessment or a case or an individual become more compelling for us than the others. But actually, they don't necessarily outweigh the others, and this is important. And finally, are you being unrealistically optimistic? Also, now if we think about procedural improvements, well, would decision trees and flows, as I explained them, be more helpful? Because one of the major problems we have when we write things like the risk of serious harm guidance or any of these kinds of procedures is how closely we are able to mimic and assist real world decisions. Now, let's just take a few minutes to think about that. Firstly, picture your own procedures back home and ask yourself how well a novice, somebody appointed this week, how well assisted or otherwise they would be by your current risk procedures. And just to drive that home a bit, let's all imagine that we've bought a DIY cabinet from IKEA or some such place, and imagine that we've got to put together this cabinet, we've got to build it, and we've got the instructions in front of us, but actually we've never seen a screw before and we've never held a screwdriver. So this makes the point that perhaps some procedures and some processes as described assume rather too much about knowledge and skill, and you have to ask that about your own procedures and guidance. Are you assuming too much knowledge and skill in order to be able to implement what you've written down? In addition to that, are staff clear about desirable outcomes and priorities? So is it desistance or is it risk management? Is it desistance or is it public safety? Now I hear that one all the time, and it's presented to me like two polar opposites warring against each other. Now personally I think it's public safety, and I think that forms the context within which such difficult balancing acts have to take place, such as how much and the type of supportive desistance work can actually take place alongside risk management. Try and focus on practice standards that are actually about quality outcomes, and build in appropriate measures of risk reduction and appropriate measures of the amount of safety and the amount of safety achievements you are actually getting. Returning to my earlier question as an example of this, what would be a good risk assessment? What would it actually look like, and what would be the core components of it? We also need to think about any organisational improvements we need to make. So is there a demonstrable lead on professional standards and quality outcomes for risk in your organisation? Also, in terms of your contact with staff, do you provide constructive and questioning supervision? For example, what is the evidence for that? Why do you think that? Why do you think that these are the best actions to take? What are you trying to achieve? What will be a good outcome, and for whom? Also think about the learning of lessons. Now we have far too many inquiries, and do we learn the lessons? Well, Shepherd, for example, did an analysis over 25 years of mental health inquiries, and he found that very sadly we don't. Also, I am beginning to personally wonder that part of the issue on that is how we actually package things from inquiries. So, for example, we often stress improvement and learning the lessons and correcting failures and correcting mistakes. If you think about it, that's very negative language, and it's error language already. Would it be better for us to actually package responses in terms of stressing continuous improvement and the progress that we want to make? So positive aspirational language about quality standards. Also, every organisation needs to accept that staff are making decisions under conditions of uncertainty, and that most decisions require balance. And it's our job as leaders, managers, supervisors in organisations, and indeed when we're doing it with offenders, to help them get that balance better. So just as we move towards a conclusion, just to think about some further tips for today, I wanted to include these because they've been shown in some recent failures and recent inquiries. First is an issue of compliance. Now, are we seeing compliance or is it deception? Do we fully understand deception and what that's like for offenders and how they manage to achieve it with us? And can staff recognise deception? And does staff recognise the difference between compliance and deception? And some of that is linked to forced compliance. And we in a way, we can almost incentivise forced compliance because of the faulty or perverse bargains that we strike with offenders. So, for example, to get something desirable from us, offenders almost have to mirror compliance. So the compliance that we see does not come from the offender reframing their behaviour or accepting that their behaviour needs to change. It's actually a rational cost-benefit assessment of, I need A from her, so I will do B. And sometimes we haven't really unpackaged that well enough. This can lead to what we might almost call an unreliable compliance. That is, workers believing risk is falling or under control because of the presumed compliance. But this builds in an unreliability to risk assessment and to risk management responses at a very early stage. And we fail to sufficiently weigh those factors which make risk endure, last, or indeed re-emerge as soon as circumstances allow. So a key question is always, has the risk gone away? And I just want to take a few minutes to consider that. So if we had a more nuanced and subtle understanding of risk, we might understand it in terms of three differing characteristics. The first is what we know as predisposing risks, such as early life trauma, childhood experiences, emotional development, those kinds of things. And they literally predispose someone to conduct their life in a particular way, solve life's challenges in a particular way, and actually to deal with their problems in a particular way. Those can be very hard to shift, but some intensive programs can help, and many individuals learn to live with and rise above such predispositions. Then another category of risk are those which are precipitating. They're often about personality and learned behaviours and immediate reactions and habituated responses to things like stress and challenge, and often linked to issues about failure to self-regulate. We often call these triggers. They are often more immediate and contextual. They are often the focus for much work, and they can be amenable to degrees of management, including self-management by the person, if well taught. Then there are the third category of risks, which are often called perpetuating risks. These are the factors that will make risk endure, last. Beliefs, justifications, entrenched behaviours, very deep-seated value systems, established worldviews that all justify continued offending. Now, these are often linked and deeply embedded in a person's self-identity. It's how they see themselves and how they see the rest of the world. They are the most difficult to change. They often take a lot of time, and sometimes they don't change at all. They can be contained by environmental controls, so for example, prison or different things that we do under supervision, but they will often reappear when the time is right. And just to make that point, think about the terrorist on the London Bridge. So important questions for you are, which are still there, and what makes the risk of this person endure? Also, I'm asked a lot these days about desistance and risk. Again, as I said earlier, as if they are two polar opposites pulling against each other in some way. But I do not believe this. And I think that there are particular actions supportive of desistance which also contribute to good risk management. And in my view, the most helpful are the focus on legitimate and positive goals for the person, trying to reframe the offender's view towards benefits and away from risks. And remember that for some offenders, their risky behaviours are deeply rewarding, but that cost-benefit reframing needs to change. Work on establishing resilience and coping rather than fatalism. fatalism is often associated with a slide into risk. So when people say this is too hard, I can't do this, I was better off in custody, all of those things are indicative that risk is coming. Emphasise positive choices and self-efficacy. So the person needs to know that they action their own future. They're not a mere pawn or a victim in the world where things happen to them, and it's about them becoming more agentic, and it's more about I can rather than I can't. Focus on protective factors that are genuinely protective for that person in that situation, and hooking the person up to safe and positive social networks that model pro-social behaviours but also provide a degree of natural vigilance on the person. And then access to resources and practical help to overcome what are often called the pains of desistance. And within all of that, there are very important balancing acts that we're not paid that much money to do, and when we get them wrong, well, as I said, it's the doers what get the blame. But these balancing acts are absolutely critical. The first, of course, is risk versus rights, and it's an essential one. And our system does limit the right to be risky to some extent, but the evidential bar is reasonably high. You are expected to weigh up in a transparent and evidential way, for example, the right of an offender or ex-offender to non-stigmatisation against the right to disclose for public safety. Also, reintegration versus risk management can often be a tension, and staff often really struggle with that one, but there are some solutions. The first is to accept that the overarching aim is public safety, and therefore public safety provides the context for these balancing acts. Now, that doesn't mean an automatic default to over-precaution and an automatic default to uncritical pursuit of safety in all cases. But it does mean the following things. You have to ask whether something can be done safely. So, for example, can the person go to church? Can that be done safely? Assess and evidence the answer to that question. You also have to demonstrate that you have asked what else could reasonably be put into place to make it more safe and thereby potentially more acceptable. If you conclude it is not safe, then you must demonstrate on what grounds and evidence base that you conclude that, and you must record it well. Your actions have to be proportionate with a level that is commensurate with public safety. You can be precautionary up to a point, but you must be evidenced, reasonable and justified. Remember that all decisions potentially come under public scrutiny, including legal challenge, so be prepared, be explicit and record well. So let's conclude with some overview points as to why risk management fails. Well, firstly, poor assessment and that faulty decision making we've talked about today, and particularly a lack of problem definition, so we set out to solve the wrong things. Mismatched interventions, so we do what we know, we do what we like, we do what we're good at, we do what our organisation can easily provide, but it's not always what is required, and we tend to under-focus on behaviours. We do not deliver with integrity. For many reasons, we do not do what we say we will do. Now, those gaps become the seeds of future risk. Most inquiries will show you that. Staff take shortcuts in their decision-making and in their responses. Why wouldn't they? Work is exhausting, it's never-ending, it's often challenging, and sometimes it is very disheartening. So, of course, we take shortcuts. It's our job to help staff not to do that. System failure, particularly around case reviews. They are not always thorough or focused on the right things. Is anything really changing for the better? And what is the evidence for that? Is risk really reducing, and how do we know? Those are the drivers for review. And lack of response to changes in circumstances, and lack of response to those red flags of risk I talked about earlier. And many serious further inquiries highlight that. Now, it's an important question to reflect on that, because when you look at it with hindsight, it doesn't make any sense. So what we have to ask ourselves is, why do we or our staff fail to recognise and respond to the red flags of risk? What gets in the way? Those are the questions we have to deal with. not be surprised when it's happened, but actually say what is getting in the way of staff recognising and responding to the red flags of risk. Failure to enforce, well, that failure is less common than it was many years ago, but I always say to people, think about the small enforcements, the small enforcement on conduct and on behaviour, that it's not acceptable to be late. It is not acceptable for offenders not to do what they say they will do, because that boundary setting and that rule setting becomes important to the bigger issues of risk management that you want to pursue. In essence, it's the little things that can count. Also, we have a failure to revise sufficiently those plans which are not working, and I've seen this at too many panels. If it's not working, then change it. If it's not working, the key question is, what do we need to do differently? Establish that and then do it. The answer to something not working is not merely to do more of it, more often and more loudly. That really doesn't work, and it just wastes more resources. So coming to the end of the talk, I want to leave you with a final conundrum, really, a final thought to leave you with. And I actually think it's probably a thought that the current government and Prime Minister Johnson are pondering almost every day of the COVID pandemic. They might use slightly different words, but I think the conundrum is probably still the same. And it's this. More recently, actuarialism has fueled preemptive responses to crime, particularly, although not exclusively, to terrorism, raising the spectre of a pre-crime society predicated almost entirely on threat management at the expense of eroding collective freedoms and rights. This raises important questions about how much risk we are prepared to tolerate to preserve freedom, or how much freedom we are prepared to relinquish to eradicate risk. Neither position can be totalising or complete. In addition, safety and risk are not in themselves polar opposites. Rather, they are two sides of the same coin, and how they are balanced is a major challenge for contemporary societies. Less risk implies more safety, but also less personal choice over our own actions and less freedom. These considerations raise important questions about the level and types of risk we are prepared to tolerate and at what cost, but also about the types of risks we wish to avoid and manage, those we deem as bad, and ultimately the type of society we wish to live in. So thank you for listening today. The references and the PowerPoint will be circulated, and if there's time, I'm happy to take some questions, either through Steve or through the chat, or however that's best managed. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Hazel. If anybody does have any questions for Hazel, just stick their hand up and get you. Will do the best we can. Doesn't look like we have any questions at this time, Hazel. Just to say, I've just sent you all an email apologising for the hiccup at the start. Hopefully we've got past that, no problem. This has been recorded, this event, so why not show it to your teams at a lunch and learn or at a team meeting, and that means everyone can benefit from it. So you should be able to access the recording shortly by simply logging back into the Microsoft Teams link that you've used to join the meeting today. The recording is usually automatically on there. If it's not, drop me a line at insights@justice.gov.uk and we'll see if we can get a link out to you, and you will get the slides and any other materials that Hazel wants as soon as she gets them across to us. So just again, last time of asking, anyone want to ask any questions or make any comment on the presentation? No, it doesn't look like it. All it remains for, oh, hold on, we have a hand up. Who do we have with a hand up? Unfortunately, I can't see who that is. If you've just stuck your hand up, unmute yourself and fire away.
Hello, it was me. It's Deborah Perkins. I'm being brave by putting my hand up and asking a question. Hazel, I was really interested in the bit where you spoke about how difficult it is to proceduralize risk decisions, and because there are too many options to get onto paper. And I'm thinking about that within the context of some work that's currently being undertaken on something called human factors. and that's based on work within the aviation system and NHS, and it looks at standardising procedures to try and take away some of that kind of thinking and manage risk in that way. And I wondered whether you kind of knew anything about that and whether the two can be reconciled and what your thoughts were on that.
I did look at this earlier in my career, and I looked at railways and all sorts of things, nuclear industry and things. So where things tend to be very heavily proceduralised because the risks tend to be catastrophic when they happen. And also medical procedures. So for example, nurses. So something like injecting people on wards is very heavily proceduralised because it's where the NHS make mistakes they end up getting litigated against. I think it is really hard. If you write to me when you see the email on the PowerPoint slides, I will try and send you some material. The problem is that you have to do an awful lot of work with practitioners about how they actually make decisions, how they weigh things up, and this stepping process that they're going through, so that then you can sort of proceduralise in a way that mimics that. Because otherwise, what tends to happen is that you go from step 1 to step 4 too quickly, and you have assumed that people know what the in-between is going to be, if that makes sense. You go back to that building of the cabinet, and if you don't actually explain to somebody that there should be 6 screws, and then have a little picture of what a screw looks like, and then you need a screwdriver and it needs to look like this, it has to have the square on the end so that it fits, not be and it's about how we miss out some of those things, and then a person is halfway through what they're trying to do and they just realise that they've catapulted over so many things, they can't capture it, and it becomes really, really difficult. You have the same problem when you try to create online learning materials. You jump too far ahead, and that becomes a problem. So just write to me when you get the contact, and we can go into that in more detail.
Oh, thank you so much. That was really helpful. I really, really appreciate that. Thank you.
Any more? It would seem not. So it simply falls to me to say thank you to Professor Hazel Kemshall, and indeed to all of you for joining us. And thanks again also for putting up with the slight hiccup we had. I'm sorry it was unavoidable. We hope it hasn't taken too much away from the event. Okay. All the best, everyone.
Thanks for doing that, Steve. Thank you. Bye now.
All the best.
Thank you. Bye.